And it's something that we always screen for significantly when we add people to the team is like, how good is their written communication? And I actually think that if you take asynchronous communication and the ability to think through what you're writing well, editing yourself, being thoughtful, intentional about what you want to say, and then sending off that message and giving the person on the other side time to read, think, read again, think, and then reply, like that's much better, right?
Hey, this is Gareth Webb, and you're listening to Breakout, a show that cuts through the hiring noise. Here, you'll get an unfiltered view on what early and growth stage companies are doing so that you can take their best practices, processes, and frameworks and implement them to help you build teams more confidently. Morning, Adii. How are you? Well, good afternoon.
I'm really great. Yes, afternoon. I'm great in yourself, Gareth.
Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and where you live, where you're from? You're not like our usual audience of tech founders here in the US. Do you want to give a little bit of an introduction to the background?
Yeah, so I'm born and bred Cape Townian, so right at the kind of the tip of Southern Africa. Live here with my family, live out in the wineland as well. I consider myself a bit of I would say wine snob, but I think a wine enthusiast. This is probably the more diplomatic term to use over there. And then I've been a bit of a one-trick pony, Gareth, in terms of business at least. I'm onto my third kind of your known company. At least I've sold the previous two, all in the e-commerce space. So WooCommerce was, WooThemes and WooCommerce was my first business, sold that to Automatic. And I subsequently founded a company called Convergio thereafter, where we built email marketing automation for e-commerce brands, sold that in 2019, just pre-pandemic, spent the pandemic trying to invest in peace with the acquirer. And then towards the back end of that, got that familiar entrepreneurial itch again. And I started working on an idea that is now a well-funded company called Cogsy, where we are building inventory optimization and management tools for e-commerce brands. So really, as I said, like a bit of a one-trick pony there in terms of sticking to e-commerce, like fell into it and just have stuck to it since.
So take it back to the beginning a little bit. So like you say fell into e-commerce, but I mean, e-commerce is obviously huge and rapidly, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, like post-pandemic, it's growing, it's complicated. I'd say especially across the last few years, like scaling and running e-commerce businesses, especially cross-border, must be particularly tricky. But like how did you fall into it?
So I also fell into kind of your WordPress and WooThemes, which was the precursor to WooCommerce. But the kind of the arc there was way back. I mean, this is probably 2005, 2006. I decided that kind of all the cool kids have blogs these days, and I wanted a blog. And I was a somewhat proficient kind of, I would say HTML, coder. I'd done a bit of computer science in high school, and I knew my way around kind of, a little bit of code. So in researching kind of platforms at the time, stumbled on WordPress, was very, very new, taught myself how to kind of at least kind of tweak, templates or themes. And then that really evolved into kind of ultimately doing the same for kind of clients, doing some paid consulting there. And that was what kind of led to the creation of kind of WooThemes, which was really prioritizing the service that I was doing. Found my two kind of co-founders, Magnus and Mark, through that. And probably for the first 3 odd years, we found this kind of growing kind of market segment. We were building what I would now call a kind of a business or brochure like kind of website for kind of traditional businesses that were coming online, right? They knew they needed a presence online, and we were helping them. And for $70 at a time, we would give them the kind of basic template that they could start using to get online quickly, efficiently, and in a cost-efficient manner, right? And from there, like I said, like 3.5 year kind of timeline, those same businesses, those customers of ours, started asking us like, "Hey guys, like how do we add a shopping cart to our website?" And that really was that kind of that catalyst for us then saying like, well, what is out in market, right? And there were like 2 or 3 kind of options available, and we didn't feel like they would meet our standards in terms of what we wanted to put out there, because we still thought we would just build the templates on top of it, right? So like jack it into WordPress, you connect it, and you just need the front end, which we would handle. That was our speciality. But that ultimately put us down that kind of rabbit hole where we ended up kind of forking an open source project that became WooCommerce. And then within the kind of the stat that I always remember, within a year of releasing WooCommerce, we were already doing kind of a multi-millions, single-digit millions a year in revenue at the time. And within a year of releasing WooCommerce, it became 90% of our business. So
Mhm.
not only did it grow significantly, but it also completely flipped what we were doing. So like it wasn't kind of, hindsight being an exact science, of course. Like, yes, we took chances and we explored it and we listened to customers. Like we did a bunch of intentional things. But if you asked me kind of, when I started down this path of kind of WordPress, in 2005, 2006, would I would I contribute to building one of the biggest e-commerce platforms in the world? Then no, like that was not the plan or the intention.
And so you were acquired by Automatic, which is pretty insane. Were you in Cape Town when you started and ran WooCommerce?
Yes. So I ultimately kind of, I was not around anymore. Most people don't realize this and know this. I was not around anymore kind of, by the time the acquisition happened to Automatic in 2015. I had stepped out from the business at the back end of 2013. And when I had stepped out, I think there's two interesting things. When I stepped out, the team was probably about 40 people at the time, and only a quarter of them were based in Cape Town, and the rest of our team members were kind of, scattered and remote. The other interesting fact is it took Magnus, Mark, and I a full 18 months of working together initially before we ever met up in person. So we completely built the kind of foundations of the business for 18 months as a team before we ever met up
And this
in
is like
person.
10, 11, 12 years ago, this is like way before remote was like widely adopted.
Yeah, this is 2007. I built the first product that became WooThemes end of 2007. So this is like 2007, 2008. Yes. Like, it was remote working. Like today, there's a lot of, I think, content and kind of best practices out there. Like back then, like we were one of the only companies, doing it. Not the only, obviously, but it wasn't a super prevalent thing with like loads of kind of your knowledge and experience to help guide founders in terms of how do you build culture in a remote team, for example.
Yeah. Just very quickly, like for some nostalgia, like what were you using? Like Skype or Citrix? Like what was the...
Yeah, we were using Skype, and
Yeah.
we almost never did voice calls, and we definitely never did kind of video calls. Like video calls were awkward back then. You just didn't do it, and we just had these kind of a big kind of running different kind of your chats within Skype. That's the way we ran the business at the time, and we sent a lot of internal kind of email. I think the first kind of unlock was probably in starting to use I think Basecamp. It was the first project management system we used at the time, and that really, I now understand that as the key unlock was not the project management part, but was the kind of the skill or the motion of asynchronous communication. That's not how I would have described it back then, but that really became a kind of a connective tissue and glue within the kind of a team, and helped us kind of grow to that team of 40 odd by the time I'd left.
Yeah, I think there's just something around the discipline of like distilling communications down, like if the whole like having some sort of centralized tooling, messaging, not just email chains, but like being forced to be remote can force you to focus on the essential items rather than being distracted, which I think is kind of the big failure point for a lot of businesses, especially earlier stage businesses, is just distraction, right? So I think if you're just super focused on what you're doing and as three stakeholders, you're focused on business outcomes or customer outcomes, that's the beauty, in my opinion, of distributed and remote work anyway, just sort of sometimes declutters thinking and communications. So
Yes, and just on that, like I think it's interesting. I mean, Slack is obviously a multi-billion-dollar company today, but a large part of what the kind of the real-time nature of Slack and the kind of the easy way of having a conversation probably kind of it takes away like that part that you speak about, which is and it's something that we always screen for significantly when we add people to the team is like how good is their written communication. And I actually think that if you take asynchronous communication and the ability to think through what you're writing well, editing yourself, like being thoughtful, intentional about what you want to say, and then sending off that message and giving the person on the other side time to read, think, read again, think, and then reply, like that's much better, right? Like, yes, there's some conversations that need a little energy, and in person or a video call, for example, it's just better, like some synchronous way of having a conversation. But most communication and conversations and decisions, I think, is probably better and more thoughtful or more holistically considered when it's done in writing.
Yeah, I hugely agree. I think like everybody's so quick to type and jump the gun and react. And that's fine in your social life, I think. Like for business, yeah, you need a little more like stoicism around decision making. So like that success with WooCommerce to automatic like this massive company, right? And then a lot of people don't still know like really who they are, but like how did that come about?
Woo itself was kind of one of the earlier kind of movers in terms of, I'd say in terms of building a company within the WordPress ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
And essentially saying, here's a way in which we can build a business and build products and still adhere to the open source nature of the kind of the platform on which we build. So, I mean, at the time, there were probably like 3-4 kind of breakout companies, all started on the templating side, but then really kind of started to, I would say, kind of show the way for how others can do similar and build similar. So like through that, I got to kind of get to know Matt Mullenweg himself. And like we were always just very, very close. As I said, like my own exit from Woo was a little tricky, and there was a little while in which I wasn't as close to my co-founders as I should have been. So I heard the news about the acquisition when it was announced on TechCrunch on the day, for example. So like it's interesting in the sense that up until that point, Automattic had never purchased or made an acquisition in the WordPress ecosystem itself. They'd always kind of done kind of but more like acqui-hires or like acquisitions of interesting tech that they wanted to bring into the ecosystem or platform. And it really was the kind of the first. And I think it kind of in hindsight makes total sense, right? I mean, WooCommerce kind of rivals Shopify, at least in terms of volume of merchants and transactions. And to that extent, I mean, it's a perfect synergistic kind of fit to Automattic and owning the WordPress platform that I think still powers almost 40% of the web today. So having that and having the commerce part, like always made sense.
Yeah. Let's talk about like what happened after that. So you've worked on 4 businesses in a row. So it's like Public Beta, CM Commerce, Cogsy now. Can you distinguish or distill down, or is it more of like a random process of like starting companies as to like knowing what really made one or some of them truly successful versus, ones that maybe weren't?
I've tried to be thoughtful about kind of going from one company to the next. Right? I think going back to kind of Woo, a big part of why I left Woo was I wanted to prove to myself that I'm not a one-hit wonder, right? That I can create another, company of some significance at least. Didn't have to be as significant, but like I wanted to see whether I can do that. And the crucial question that I'd kind of asked myself at least is, can I take the best bits that I've learned through this journey and reapply them, and then keep an open mind to what else I need to learn going forward? And I think that's ultimately going from business to business. That's been kind of a core part of like how I think about it. Is like there are always some things that you learn that fall in that kind of realm of what you would classify as kind of universal best practices, right? I'm very cautious about saying that because I think every company, especially if there's big kind of time periods between them, you build a business in a different time, right? And the challenges are just slightly different. But then some things become a little bit more universal, right? So I know that something that is close to your way of thinking in terms of talent and how you build teams. Like one of the biggest things that I focused on kind of post Woo was like culture, for example, was something that I now understand like happened to us at Woo. Like we weren't intentional or thoughtful about culture. So going into my second business, like the key for me was like, can I build this business and be very thoughtful about the kind of culture that I wanted to create, right? So really thinking through kind of your values from day one and how you turn values into kind of an actual culture. And like on that front, like going from kind of that business to Cogsy now, there's again an evolution and progression, right? So you take the things that worked, you keep them, and then you try a bunch of new things and figure out like, how do you augment this thing? Or like, what else, can I add to the mix here that is accretive and in some manner?
Yeah. I mean, that's talking about like culture happening to you versus like the tail wagging the dog versus like you creating culture and like building it out. I think it's very different to what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago, in my opinion, with not just with remote and distributed work, but what people want from work. I think historically people join companies probably because of the culture and whether it's vibe in office or perks or what that does for you in terms of where you can say you work. But if you work for like smaller businesses that are not particularly well known, that sort of means a lot less nowadays. There's more startups, there's more singular, narrow focused businesses, and a lot of people don't care about in-office vibe or culture or whatever the terminology should be. So we kind of like talk to lots of founders and talent leaders and venture capital firms, and it's all changed. Like, it's not really like what we can do for you as an employee anymore. It's like, are you in for the mission? The mission is like, this is what we're trying to do and build for our customers. That then defines the way we work and the outcomes and the thinking. And like, that's what we want people to buy into. It's the same with us. Like, we're helping companies scale teams. We're helping people transition stressful periods or from one job that could be fine into a more challenging one, or, they're at risk because their company's not doing great and it's all very stressful. So, we take that really like quite seriously, and that defines the way we behave and the way that day-to-day activity sort of to defines the way we go about our job each day and our attitudes. And that, again, to your point, like values or principles, kind of like, we've kind of spent a lot of time thinking about that, just so that there's consistency of, not so that everyone's the same at work, but so there's a sort of like a full alignment on here's why we're here. We're not just here to get paid and maybe make some money one day. We're here to solve this very complicated problem, and we all need to be dialed into that. How have you gone about that now with Cogsy? Because you started it in 2020. Are you fully distributed and remote again?
Yes. So I actually think like on that part, like I think we need to do one or two things, right? Like, either you have the whole team in the same office, or it's fully remote and distributed. I don't think like that hybrid model, for example, that we had at Woo, it's just much, much harder to pull that off, because either like, if you think through like having an office and having a distributed team, that hybrid model, it's very easy for me to walk to your desk and say, hey, Gareth, powwow, like let's bash this out. And we make a decision, right? And that's very private. You and I did that. When you also have a remote and distributed team, you need to both of us need to have that discipline of then saying like, hey, rest of the team, we had this conversation, right? So I think that's just much harder. Whereas if you do one or the other, it's simpler for human beings to follow. And you're less prone to kind of your humans not being ill-disciplined.
Very quickly on that point, because you then have the in-office crowd and the not in-office crowd, and then there's like an out of sight, out of mind human nature, right? Exactly. Just to sort of index in on the physical world versus the digital world, which is what people perceive remote workers to be.
Exactly right. So I think that just creates unnecessary friction or temptation, right? So I would avoid that. That's one of those things that I'm just not keen about, and I always advise founders to avoid that. About culture, like I think what is helpful here is my now co-founder was also my first engineering hire in my previous business. So like, to that extent, like it's great having co-founder that is also very eloquent in terms of like what values are, right? And what it means. Like, values shouldn't just be something that's written on a wall, for example. Like, that's useless. So I think that for me, at least, when I think about culture, and if I had to distill it down, like, I think it just comes down to clarity. You only get clarity in kind of in culture if you actually talk about it, right? So like, the key for me is always to take core kind of emotion for us in the team is always to take whatever values that we understand kind of we want to adhere to. And whenever something happens within the business that relates to that, is to be able to make that link and be very explicit about it. Like, hey team, we made this decision or we took this action because this is our value, right? Because values are a little airy-fairy. You have to always link it to an action. And you need to kind of you drumbeat those things over and over again. Like, over time, you start with the values and the values can become a culture. But then if you don't bring it back to the values, then the culture, the ultimate actions will start dictating the culture, right? And then you can drift very far away from values. And I say that in the sense that values can also change over time. I don't think one needs to be kind of rigid about like, hey, we said these 5 things are our values. They can change over time, and that's fine. But it should be an explicit and intentional change. It shouldn't be something that creeps up on you. I think that's the kind of the worst part thereof. And I think to your point earlier about kind of that mission alignment is, I think that's how teams pick individuals and individuals pick teams these days. Is like, they can only be aligned when they're very clear about, hey, this is the goal, right? Like, this is what we want to build as a kind of company and as a product. This is how we're going to do that. And if there isn't that clarity, then you can't get to alignment. And like, I truly believe that teams can, like, you can be a little bit exclusive in that regard. Like, not every team should be open to every individual. I think kind of your individual teams that match and fit kind of should pick each other, right? And that's perfectly fine. Like, this isn't counter kind of or contradictory to, for example, building a diverse and inclusive team. That's not what I mean there.
Yeah, I agree. You don't hire the same but you don't hire the same people for appearance, sounds, interests. It's diversity of thought within a framework of a belief system or a mission.
Exactly. And I think and that's something that I test for, for us at least, the easiest hack that I found in terms of recruiting, for example, is I will always, on the initial application, I'll always ask you, why do you want to join my team? And if you can't give me something within the first sentence or two that's very specific to what we're doing, if you tell me, Adii, it's because I want a remote job, I won't check anything else. You might be the best human being and potentially the best person to work on our team. I just exclude you, right? You have to show me that that there's something that you saw about how we're operating, what we say about ourselves that resonates, and you put some thought into that, right? I think that's the first step in terms of also coaching someone or indicating that alignment is important. We're very clear about what we're doing, so we need to align on that first, and then we can chat about the rest of the things.
Yeah, I think it's are they going to turn up and care? And that, the only way you know that is if they can eloquently explain why they want to do it, and why is that? What's the connection? So, as while we're on the subject of hiring, and you're a startup guy, and so what are the things you've said there? Up front, you look for people stating why they want to join you. What are the skills and expertise you look for when you're in build mode for people coming to your team?
So we mostly focus on the soft skills, right? I think I would say the hard skills or the kind of your role specific skills, I would always almost defer to kind of your past experience, right? And if you did something similar, then that ticks a box initially, and I move on, right? For some things, for example, when we are hiring for engineers, we will eventually do a code test with them, so we will verify that what we saw, your past experience matches kind of your skill level or vice versa, right? So we will do those, but the more important things for us are the soft skills. So once you pass that initial kind of your barrier, yes, there's some alignment here, you've done some work to show us that you want to work with us, okay, and you seem to have the kind of the resume or past experience to be able to do this job, then we flip completely over to kind of a perspective where we're hiring people over skills, right? So there, I want to get to know you, right? You need to be able to communicate well. I think that's the first part. Both in writing, we do a bunch of kind of your text-based questionnaires, and then we do kind of asynchronous video as well. So we want to be able to see both, those things, because those are the two ways in which we communicate, and ultimately kind of interchange ideas and kind of thoughts and skills, right? So we do those things. Beyond that, kind of, I would almost say the key for me in trying to ascertain with any team member is their kind of curiosity and ability to learn new things. Ultimately, I don't care if someone is on a scale, right? They're a 8 out of 10 kind of a programmer today. That's fine. If it's a 7, doesn't matter. It's the 8. That's, I think, moot, right? What is more important is to what extent is that your person kind of willing and interested and curious enough to learn and improve, right? Because that's something that we can empower. I think that's a much easier thing and a kind of less risky kind of path to take than trying to figure out who really is a kind of a 10 out of 10 kind of engineer on day one, right? Because most of these things you only learn once you get to work with someone, right? I don't think my gut feels you can't be perfect on that. So we truly value that kind of learning ability, and I said learning and the curiosity around that, and how one takes responsibility. We really index highly for that and try to do that. And then we try and build out how does that kind of work persona or that professional persona relate to your interests at home. I mean, something as big for us as a team is we want you to bring your whole self to work. And I think I'm not going to dictate what balance in someone's life needs to look like. What I do know is the best people have varied interests and connections, right? Their colleagues, they don't describe their colleagues as their family, right? They have an actual family, for example. They don't exclusively talk about the lines of code they wrote today. they talk about the game or football or something else that they're kind of geeking out about as well, kind of beyond just work. So we really try that's really how we think about hiring people and index for some of those kind of soft skills or characteristics versus the actual kind of role specific skills.
So soft skills, the actual person behind the skills, and then how much they care. And then you said you empower are they willing and open to learning, and you empower that. Just explain a little there, like, how do you empower that? Is there because there's plenty of people who we talk to are like, we don't have time to allow people to get good. We want them in on day one and good, which I think is obviously really short-sighted, because people can be good at one place and then they can still be great with you, but they still need time. Like, everybody needs time. How do you empower that improvement?
Seek out and kind of get people that we add to the team is, the ability to take initiative, right? Because what I ultimately, the easiest way, I don't consider, I'll take a step back. I don't consider myself a bad coach, right? And a coach in the kind of professional environment, right? And I think a key with a coach doesn't tell you what to do, right? They just constantly reflect things back, similar to what a therapist does, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's the person on the other side of the conversation that should take the initiative and ultimately kind of do things, right? So the way we try and do that within the team is we try and find people that are comfortable with taking initiative and running with things, and then we will just back them to whatever extent, right? So whether that is, hey, someone puts their hand up and say, listen, I want to learn this new thing. Can you make budget available? Like, hell yes. Motivate why this is important, how this fits into kind of our vision and our mission, then go for it, right? That's a simple example. Other things granular level, if you want to lead a project, just put your hand up and do that, and I will back you. If you say, Adii, I want to improve as a kind of as a project leader or manager, then do that. That's what we mean with empower. So empowering means two things for us. Is it's always kind of implied that there is space for people to put their hands up and take initiative, right? And we purposely leave that space there as much as we can before filling it. So the space is there, and then once someone puts their hand up, we will back them, and we'll accept that they might not always nail it perfectly first time, but as long as they're learning and improving, and they can be accountable, and one of our values is peer-to-peer accountability, right? Defaulting to trust. So as long as those things are in place, then the kind of success or failure in this first time you put your hand up, again, is moot. I only care about the learning. I don't care about the binary state of success or failure.
Yeah, there's too many nuanced fluctuations and variables, I think, on a occasional basis. So tell people what kind of stage you're at, where you're at in terms of Cogsy and funding and kind of product and customers. Yeah.
So I would say, we raised about $6 million to date across a pre-seed and a seed round. Currently working our way to some Series A milestones. So that's in our near-term future. At least the full-time team today, we're 16 of us scattered all over. And I would say we are...
scattered all over the world, or?
Yes. So all over the world, most of it. So, I mentioned I'm in Cape Town. Stefan and my co-founders in Zurich. The kind of the I would say half the team is in a kind of within an hour or two of us, right? So Central European time. And then we have some team members towards Asia, and then some people towards the East Coast of the States. I believe, and that's the thing that I believe in, when you're building a remote team, you need to have enough time zone overlap so that all team members at least have a kind of an hour or two a day of overlap.
Yeah.
Within some kind of normal-ish workday or average-ish workday, right? If you can't have that and have the option for some kind of synchronous communication, doesn't have to be in a meeting or on a call, but for some synchronous collaboration at least, I think it's hard.
Yeah, interesting. So you've raised a decent amount of money. That's good. And you're not stupidly big. You're competing with other bigger firms with more money. What's you and your co-founders' way of trying to be compelling to new hires?
Firstly, not trying to pay them the most amount of money. I think anyone that wants the most amount of money, I respect that, and then we're not a great fit, right? I think our being eloquent about and clear about our culture and how we work, that's probably the best way we've gone about it. And I think, as we chat, we just came back a couple of weeks ago from our last team offsite, and that's the feedback that we get from the team, which is And we've had a team member, for example, that's unfortunately leaving us to pursue a passion project. And the way she described it was that, because we were also straight out of university, we were our first job, and we competed against Google for her, and we told her up front, like, listen, like, I don't even care what Google is offering you, like, we're not gonna even get close to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then she described this as saying, her words were, I was skeptical at first, like everything sounded way too good to be true. But everything you mentioned at the start in terms of how you work and how you think about your teams and building teams, have been true, right? And for us, like, those things really are like beyond our values. Like, it is really about supporting the unique individual as the unique individual they are. And I truly believe, I think the core, what we try and do is we try and empower the individual to live the life that they want, right? Because I think if they do that, then they also bring their best self to work, right? And their best self is what I need for them to be at work. But for them to do that, they need to have all the other things in their life figured out. So, like, if we can do small things, like, for example, if we have team members that have kids, right? There should never be any guilt from any parent for canceling a last minute meeting or last minute taking a day out because they have got a kiddo related emergency. Like, that's just a simple thing that I think any employer can do, right? Like, it's such a complete like misnomer in our team. Like, it's not even a thing. Like, it just happens. Like, it's just accepted that's the way it should happen. So I think, like, those things and being clear about how we think about that, even in those kind of recruiting or hiring calls initially, like, that's the way. Like, if someone hears that and they like that, then I've never had someone regret or reject a offer that we've made.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think people just, the last few years have kind of taught everybody, right, that like work's super important, but it's not life and it's not family and it's not health. It's entirely secondary to all those things. I look at your background and I'm like, God, you're doing it again. You've done it 3 times. Like, where does that desire, need, intrigue come from? Energy? Where does that come from?
Ego?
Yeah, honest answer, potentially. Yeah.
I've had an interesting journey in the last almost 10 years now in terms of like also stumbling. I was literally stumbling in life, but I stumbled into mindfulness, for example. I stumbled into philosophy. I mean, you mentioned Stoicism, like all these things. And what I'm very aware of, today I don't think the pursuit of no ego is also just ego, right? That's one of the things that I have come to kind of realize. I'm just very aware of where ego kind of plays a part. And I don't think I use ego here, and I answered you tongue in cheek by saying it's ego. Without ego, I don't think people do interesting or meaningful things in life, right? Like ego, like there has to be something about me that I put into the world, and that's why I try and do hard things, right? But that is the kind of part of the truth here, right? Is I think the opportunity to have an idea and try and manifest that idea in the world, like that's very alluring. The opportunity to kind of rally a bunch of smart human beings around you to help you manifest that idea, that's intoxicating. I can definitely be part of other teams that aren't my own, right? For example, meaning where I'm not the leader or the founder. That's probably fine as well. But for the moment, like whilst I have this opportunity, I've gravitated to doing this again. Whenever I chat to my wife, I'll tell this story. So before starting Cogsy, I went to her, I was still with Campaign Monitor, the acquirer, and I said, listen, I'm thinking about doing another company. Like, would it be okay if I do one more? And she laughed and she said, well, she always expected me to always do this, so that's fine.
Yeah.
These days, if you ask her, like, is Adii allowed to do another company? She will tell you that, and she'll reference, you say, but then there's Michelle. And what she's referencing is apparently Barack Obama was keen for another presidential campaign. And they asked him in an interview, like, Barack, would you want to do that again? And he said, yes, but there is Michelle. And apparently Michelle had said, like, there's no way that he's doing this again. So, I mean, once you, like, as I said, like, it's part of my DNA at this stage. And I can't ignore the ego part that's driven it at least partially.
We've never done anything else either, have you? Like, you are what you are, and you've worked for yourself, you've built things, and that's the skill, that's where your energy comes from. And that whenever I've gone into slightly bigger organizations and seen some of the ridiculous things that go on, like I found it hugely demotivating. and energy draining versus, seeing everybody all hands on deck and no hiding. And I think that for me comes back to, like, I like doing individual things and I love being part of a team, and I don't like people in teams that the social loafing element of just letting other people carry things like that. That's not cool. And I guess the bigger the team, the more that can happen. But yeah, I think you just got to like know who you are, and I commend you for it. Yeah, I think there's plenty of people that go out there, and I think it's more commendable to do lots of things like that versus like a timely one at the moment for me that I don't really understand is why Mark Zuckerberg's still doing what he's doing, because, he did one thing that went mad. He's been there for nearly 20 years. Not much has, like, they make a lot of money, but like, they haven't really created, like, they've acquired Instagram, they acquired WhatsApp, acquired the headset, can't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
Oculus.
So, yeah, Oculus. I feel like he would be happier and freer if he just totally started again, like just went back to doing some sort of real creative building, because now it's like this behemoth that's sort of stumbling along, and it's not what he did, but like he's held on to it, and that's a different sort of ego play, I guess, or attachment. Or I think you're smart as well with like the word ego is not a bad thing. It's when you let ego sort of manifest itself in the wrong way or take or control you in a slightly dishonest manner. Like if you have your ego in check, you can do really good things, and it can spur you on. But if it's sort of tormenting you, then you end up making bad decisions. We're coming up on time, but I wanted to ask you've had a few stabs at this, and I'm sure you've learned a lot. And like, what are the sort of 2 or 3 things you would say to people out there who are founders or business leaders, like doing tricky things at the moment in tricky times? What was some of the kind of like things that you feel everybody should take on board or try or listen to? Like, what kind of piece of advice can you give?
I really think, and we touched on it just now, Gareth, I think like knowing yourself is the part that's most important here, right? I truly believe, for example, that entrepreneurship, for example, isn't for everyone. Leading is not for everyone. And that's perfectly fine if you don't want to do either. Even if you find yourself in the position today where you're running a company and like you realize that maybe this is not for me, then I would say like go do the thing that helps you build the life that you want, right? I think that's more important than being very rigid and saying, well, I'm an entrepreneur, I can only do this. I know for myself, to some extent, like I have not fully answered this question because I've just never given myself the space to actually do this. But I often ask myself, who am I if I'm not an entrepreneur? And when you keep filling the space with new companies, then it's very hard to kind of fully answer those questions, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that's ultimately, in my mind, is part of this kind of pursuit and journey that we're all on. Getting clearer about like who you are, how like what makes you tick. That I think is still the key. I think that's ultimately more important than the company you're building. I think the last thought that I'll share there is, I think if you don't do that, and especially if you are kind of under a lot of stress, working insane hours, compromising relationships, compromising health, all those things, you are risking your physical health. Like, and we are mortal human beings. Companies can die and you can restart a new company. If you as a founder die, that's a problem, right? And it sounds exaggerated in terms of kind of you physically dying here, but I often tell founders, especially first-time founders, like this here, just remember one thing. I know you're going hard at this. I'm not going to stop you. I'm not standing in your way, but you are the most important person in this company. And if you burn out, the company suffers. It is your part of your responsibility as a leader and a founder here to figure out, like, how do I not burn out here? How do I make this sustainable? And in my mind, the only way to do that is to make sure that however you craft that kind of work and life balance, which I also think is a misnomer. I think work is just part of life, right? So however you figure out like how to live the life you want, like that's how you make the work part sustainable. And if, again, that comes down to knowing yourself, right? Like I don't think there's a perfect science or recipe for that. All of us will have our own unique way of, how we define or describe or measure.
How have you done it? Have you got like mentors? Do you have counsel? Do you have anybody other than your wife who gets to hear the truth?
Yes, I've done all of that. Therapists in the past, coaches, like both like physical coaches, as well as like meditation coaches, to executive coaches. So I've done all of it. Like I think all of those have seasons. I think ultimately, Gareth, like my kids have probably been the best coaches because they learn you, like they teach you that kind of your life is not as predictable as you think it is, and you can't control everything. And maybe that's the only thing, that and love, right? And those things are kind of your core components. So I think universal components of what it is to be, human. So, but I've done all of those things, and they've all had seasons in my life where they're more prevalent or less prevalent.
Yeah, I think the term seasons is a good one for like life, for different businesses you work in or stages of a business. And you said like one thing can work at one point and it has to change. And knowing when to change is probably what good leadership is about. What's much harder than it needs to be for you in terms of hiring people, hiring team members? What irritates you the most?
The irritating part is always around kind of just it's like filtering and moderating the initial volume. Like some positions just get an insane amount of kind of inbound interest, and like a lot of it is just once we qualify it, like we cut out 95% and it wasn't in line. So that's hard.
Yeah.
Or irritating at least. The hardest part is hiring very experienced people for senior positions and filtering for that. Like I find it much easier to hire slightly younger or more junior or less experienced and coach them up versus hiring someone that can ultimately come in and say, hey, Adii, for this role, I will tell you how are you going to do this. And that's perfectly fine. I truly believe in the idea of most problems are not a how problem, it's a who problem. You just need the right person that knows how to do this.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say I've mastered that skill just yet.
No, it's very difficult. It's highly risky. You don't know till they're in always, and it can cause problems and damage if it's not done right, or if it's not cut quick enough. Like hire slow, fire fast. It's hard to live by. Yeah, I'd agree. I think hiring people with you can see potential and energy and attitude in abundance is pretty clear, right? But like, and you know what you're getting with that kind of a hire.
Yes.
Where can people, before we wrap up, where can people connect, hear, speak, read about you? What's best? What do you prefer for people to listen, and if they want to kind of follow up with you in any way?
Yeah, so easiest is probably my personal website, which is adii.me, or I'm also at adii on Twitter, and I'm relatively active there these days.
Cool. Very good. Well, look, I really appreciate you making time. Fascinating conversation. Best of luck with Cogsy, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Breakout. If you want to hear more, make sure to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast to be the first to get notified when future episodes are released. If you like the show or want to share feedback, please leave a review so we can keep improving and share the word with other leaders in the tech talent space. If you have suggestions for topics we should cover, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Gareth.